Pursuing a master's degree in Asian Studies at the East-West Center of the University of Hawaii brought me into an even more multicultural environment, with students from all over Asia and the Pacific. The East-West Center was truly a global village. Barack Obama's mother, of course, Ann Dunham, also studied at the East-West Center, though we did not overlap there, where she met her Kenyan husband and became an anthropologist specialized on Indonesia. Barack Obama is very much the anthropologist's son in his curiosity about the world and his respect for other cultures. Something rare in American politicians and condemned by some of his critics. Remember, we have some politicians in this country who actually boast that they have never had a passport and traveled abroad, as if somehow that is an advantage. Thanks to the East-West Center, I was able to spend a year in Malaysia, working on my MA thesis on the history of the Chinese immigrant community in Sarawak, a state on the northwestern coast of Borneo. This allowed me to more intensively study a Chinese community different from Hong Kong, albeit in a society that included various other peoples, including Muslim Malays, Hindu Indians, and jungle dwellers known as Dayaks, whose ancestors were headhunters. Not to worry, Sarawak today is a very safe and comfortable place to visit or live. My youngest son was there last year, and Kathy and I went back a couple of years ago for a while too. They don't hunt heads anymore. It probably helps to have some sympathy or affinity, of course, for the people you are studying or living among. But that doesn't mean that the observer is uncritical. Any group of people has positive and negative features. One can appreciate the people and traditions of China or Malaysia or Denmark or any country without necessarily admiring all their politics and foreign policies or even all their customs. Just as many non-Americans admire our achievements, our good points, while disagreeing strongly with our foreign policies and aspects of our culture. Finally, I completed a PhD in Southeast Asian and Comparative World History at UW-Madison. Yes, Madtown in the 60s. What a trip. This allowed me another research sojourn in Sarawak, and then I spent a year in East Africa, mostly Uganda, as my wife Kathy completed her PhD research on African politics. Since coming to UWGB, I have traveled in China a few times. I've also twice spent a year teaching and researching Malaysian history as a Fulbright professor at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. I could not claim, of course, the same amount of local familiarity and language fluency as my Malaysian colleagues there, but I could bring an outsider's perspective on Malaysia and a greater knowledge of world history. I have long argued, and I could probably get an argument from this from one of my colleagues, that it would be valuable if American universities had more foreign-born and foreign-educated faculty to bring an outsider's perspective and more diverse backgrounds to the humanities and the social sciences. Critics charge that the field of U.S. history is too ingrown and often out of touch with international intellectual trends because most professors teaching and writing about it are Americans. This suggests we could benefit if more professors of U.S. history or in the U.S. came from countries with very different intellectual traditions. They would not necessarily be more or less insightful and capable historians than their American counterparts, but they might bring fresh perspectives, similar to my teaching Malaysian history in Malaysia. By exploring other cultures, we can see our own culture, of course, in new ways, appreciating some things more, including its many strengths and pleasures, while also recognizing some of the problems and the drawbacks more clearly, while learning how Americans are perceived and sometimes misperceived by other societies. It's also immensely rewarding to learn something of other languages, belief systems, foods, political attitudes, family structures, musics, and the rhythms of daily life. My colleagues and students know I have a keen interest in popular and folk musics as windows into societies and sources for studying history and politics. I have shamelessly inflicted these exotic musics, as well as a lot of rock and roll, on my UWGB students, for which I make absolutely no apologies. We teachers want to have fun in the classroom too, so rock on. Thanks to all these experiences, I was open to an historical approach that was non-centric, comprehensive, integrative, and incorporated ideas from Asian, European, Latin American, and African, as well as North American-based scholars. But I also became convinced that Americans, or for that matter, Malaysians or Chinese or any people, including historians, need to gain knowledge not only of other cultures, but the larger global context as well. So the third border crossing, then, is the widening of our horizon from the cultural, the national, and the regional to the global. Everywhere the local and the global interact, bringing change that is often exciting, but sometimes painful and disorienting. All of us live in a world in which developments in one country can affect societies on the other side of the globe. A transnational global village, in which ideas, products, finance, weapons, people, etc., routinely cross borders. It used to be said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Today, the sun never sets on McDonald's, or for that matter, on Chinese restaurants. Over the past 5 decades, take out anyone? Over the past 5 decades, many historians have become more aware of the value of understanding something of world history, the widest angle of vision, in order to comprehend their own regional specialization. Studying countries as if they are somehow completely independent of international connections is misleading, and that has been true for many centuries. Many more historians are writing books or articles on world history subjects, and even some prominent specialists on U.S. history have published work that places American history into a world context. One of the best books is by Tom Bender, who's now at NYU, but was a professor here at UWGB earlier in his career. This is a good start, but the point of world history as an academic specialization is to try to rise above centrism and a main focus on the role of any one society, whether that be the US or Britain or China or the Islamic world or whatever, to look at the world. World history embraces all societies and the connections between them. I introduced the first freshman level world history course in Wisconsin back in 1981. Now all over the United States, world history courses are common in colleges, are becoming more popular in high school. AP World History is the fastest growing AP field in high schools. So the case for world history and a more global awareness is becoming more urgent. So I was a founder and an officer of the World History Association in the early 80s. I'm still quite active. This association promotes research, study, and teaching about world history at both the secondary and college level, and has members all over the world. The rise of world history as a teaching and scholarly field is rooted in the past half-century of dramatic changes in the world. Since the 1960s, the emphasis on American and European history, which dominated history teaching in the U.S. for generations, no longer seems sufficient to prepare American students for life in a pluralistic, globalizing world, as well as an increasingly multicultural nation. As historians learned more about East Asia, Islam, ancient Ethiopia, pre-Columbian America, and so on, it was no longer intellectually defensible to view the mainstream of history as restricted largely to Europe and, more recently, North America. For example, when the Portuguese and Spanish mariners began their voyages of discovery in the 1400s, they made good use of Chinese and Arab naval and military technologies, and they were seeking, of course, the sources of the fabulous riches of the East: Chinese silks, Southeast Asian spices, Indian textiles, African gold, that they had long been acquiring through the Arabs. Confirming the importance of world history, in several surveys at the end of the last millennium, world historians named Genghis Khan, the 13th century founder of the Mongol Empire, as the most significant figure of the millennium, rather than a Western figure like Lincoln or Shakespeare or Columbus. Under the Mongol Empire, they argued, an empire that stretched from Korea to Germany, important Chinese technologies reached Europe over the trade routes, establishing some of the foundations for the later rise of Europe. Similarly, some surveys named Bob Marley, the Jamaican reggae star, as the most important musical figure of the 20th century, rather than, say, the Gershwins or Ella Fitzgerald or Bob Dylan or the Beatles, all worthy candidates, or for that matter, Madonna, the Backstreet Boys, the Spice Girls. As Bob Dylan, of course, argued, the times they are a-changing.